Quite a few of the male DIYers do use different things like welding, woodworking, and heavy machinery. And according to YouTube, that's not necessarily going to be a problem when it comes to January 2020. However, if you're more into the arts and crafts, paintings, sculpting, doll customization, squishy makeovers, you're going to be impacted. Think of the top creators in that category. We are mostly female. If you look
This particular series predominantly evaluates claims of discrimination against protected classes in a context of algorithmic fairness or unfairness. As such, Jackie, who owns the YouTube channels NerdECrafter and NerdEJackie, statement that the January 2020 changes to YouTube's policies regarding child-focused content is targeting female creators in particular came to our attention.
This is a rally for all of us here in the craft, art, and DIY community to please, maybe I'm making assumptions here, but because of the information I got from my contact at YouTube and the vague information that they've broadly said would be considered a kind of child-appealing content, I'm having a hard time sleeping at night. And I've cried quite a bit. Like, I've cried, but now I'm here for the fight.
This video is not intended to feature our personal opinions or emotions about discrimination. We condemn all legitimate cases of unfair discrimination. We respect due process. At the time of recording this video, to the best of our knowledge, we do not have any association with any of the third parties mentioned in this video. Various legal jurisdictions have protections against discrimination on the basis of certain protected characteristics, such as race, religion, and sex. In previous videos, we looked at claims of discrimination on the basis of religion, or the lack thereof, as well as alleged discrimination against the LGBT community by YouTube, that is to say, discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. In this video, we will be looking at Jackie's claim that the planned algorithmic and policy changes are discriminatory on the basis of sex and/or gender expression. For the sake of convenience, we will be referring to sex in this video, as any distinction between sex and/or gender expression does not appear to be relevant in this specific analysis, and as sex tends to be a protected characteristic in most jurisdictions, while not all jurisdictions have explicit protections for gender expression.
With me. So as of January 2020, YouTube is going to go through major, mega, hyper, giga, huge changes that will negatively impact the craft, DIY, and artsy community. Now, Garcia, what about channels that are like Mariah Elizabeth and Delightful? The language they use and the craft and their art are completely not geared towards kids, but YouTube will deem their topic as childish. And just because you do arts and crafts, it doesn't mean you are a child. Context really matters. How you present the topic should matter more than what the topic is. What if this? Alright, so here's the meat of what I'm trying to say. A lot of us crafty and DIY and artsy YouTubers are predominantly female creators. This whole rule of lumping us into a kids category is very demeaning because it says that crafting, arts, and DIYs are childish. And so again, I feel like this is going to hurt a lot of female creators. Most of us, again, are quite creative. And by putting our hobbies and what we love to do as childish, that's quite discriminatory. So suddenly male creators that would review cars, different kinds of technology, are pretty safe. But for those of us who are female creators who just love arts and crafts are suddenly at risk to become heavily demonetized because there will not be targeted ads, and suddenly we won't be able to engage with our audience. How is that fair for the most part that a lot of us, again, in the arts and crafts community, we're female for the most part? Again, I am not acknowledging, which means I am, double negatives, that we have amazing male creators in the arts and crafts community, like Jazza, Bobby Duke Arts, Ace of Clay. For the most part, they're pretty safe. But Jazza might also be considered in the at-risk, depending on the materials he uses. So for example, if he starts using Play-Doh to make a huge epic sculpture, well, guess what? The word Play-Doh is going to be flagged. And let's say he makes Spider-Man out of that clay, well, Spider-Man is a character. That's also at risk. And channel. As I stated in my letter, this goes back to the same idea where female-dominated careers made significantly less than male-dominated careers. Or even females within the same career earn less than their male counterparts in the same domain. So suddenly,
Jackie's argument essentially boils down to 1. That the arts and craft community will likely be affected by the 2020 algorithmic and policy changes. 2. That topics and/or themes are not necessarily indicative of the age of the target audience, and that as a result, the arts and crafts community may essentially show up as false positives when machine learning algorithms evaluate whether content is child-focused or not. 3. That designating traditionally feminine topics as childish is offensive and therefore inherently discriminatory. 4. That particular community consists predominantly, although not entirely, of female creators. And 5. That this would create or widen a gender earnings gap. And 6. That a policy which may widen a gender earnings gap constitutes unfair discrimination based on sex. So, how would one go about evaluating a claim of discrimination based on sex? Would one set out to evaluate if a policy has a disproportionate impact on one sex, here females, over the other, here males? Would we attempt to determine whether female YouTube creators are more likely to be affected by the planned policy changes by evaluating whether other communities consisting predominantly of males will also be affected to balance the scale, so to speak? And in order to conduct such an evaluation, would one play clips of all the Minecraft YouTubers who are afraid of being affected by the new regulations?
Sense. But then when you put in slime type videos, we're starting to get into the territory of DIYs and crafts, which means that
Jackie herself had an annotation in her video indicating that she is aware that the gaming community will likely be affected by the algorithmic and policy changes anticipated for January 2020, but that she will leave it to members of the gaming community to discuss such an impact. Traditionally, the gaming community has been perceived as being more male-orientated or male-dominated, depending on your rhetoric, just as the arts and craft community has been perceived as being more female-orientated, per Jackie's claim. So, would a proportionate loss of revenue to a predominantly male gaming community offset the anticipated loss of revenue to a predominantly female crafting community? Such an approach fails to consider the large number of concerned family vlogger channels, who tend to have nuclear family units, with one male adult and one female adult. We would have to assume that in such a case, the impact would be proportionate amongst males and females. However, more importantly, clips from such YouTubers would only serve as anecdotal evidence and are therefore of limited use in an objective analysis like this, as anecdotal evidence is not practically quantifiable. It is possible to attempt to compare channel statistics, that is to say quantifiable data, for at least a sample of well-known larger channels. But would that even be useful? Other than the fact that such an analysis for a representative sample would be a massive undertaking, if we were somehow to prove that a particular policy has a disproportionate effect on females over males, if there is a legitimate purpose to the policy, in this case complying with the legal obligation created by COPPA legislation, as well as other legitimate concerns for child safety on the platform, which originated largely from mundane maths exposure of predators on the platform, would a disproportionate outcome between males and females in and of itself equate to unfair discrimination given free market conditions? When we refer to free market conditions, we mean that there are no enforced barriers to entry into and exit from communities, either legislated or as part of YouTube policy, and that males and females are able to freely move between communities, join all of them or none of them. There is currently no claim that contains enforced entry and exit barriers that differ between the sexes, so we can assume that free market conditions do indeed exist. Available remedies for alleged unfair discrimination, such as civil suits for damages, are primarily legal determinations for the courts, and such remedies may vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. We do not intend to address potential legal remedies in this video. In order to logically demonstrate that a policy and/or algorithm is discriminatory, one would need to show that 1. There is no legitimate purpose to the policy, or that those aims could have been realistically achieved by means that would have had a more proportionate outcome. 2. That the population can be divided into subsets, one or some of which constitute a protected class, or share some protected characteristic, while others do not. 3. That membership of a protected class creates restrictions or barriers to entry, either outright prohibiting free movement between groups or making such free movement highly impractical. And 4. That there are significant, measurable differences in the outcomes between subsets that are members of a protected class or who share some protected characteristic and subsets that are not. Jackie did not attempt to provide proof of her discrimination claim, like some of the other creator case studies we have discussed before, so we can't evaluate whether a burden of proof has likely been met or not. Her claim was based solely in the fact that implying feminine activities are childish is offensive and therefore inherently discriminatory. We understand that her video was an emotional response to stress caused by an anticipated significant change and limited information. However, the fact that it may be possible to draw a potentially offensive inference does not in and of itself constitute unfair discrimination, nor is an unequal outcome automatically unfair given a competitive environment. Determining whether or not the proposed algorithmic and policy changes do indeed cause a disproportionate burden between the sexes is a resource-intensive undertaking. When resources, including time, are limited, one needs to give careful consideration to whether knowing a more precise answer to a question would make one more likely to be able to solve the problem or not. It appears that the root issue is in fact distinguishing child-focused content from family-friendly content. If such a distinction can be made reliably in a machine learning environment, the question of a disproportionate outcome becomes moot. Based on this, it appears that considerations of the gender earnings gap constitutes an appeal to emotion and an argument from consequence, both of which may constitute informal logical fallacies. We do not intend to comment on whether or not we believe that a claim of unfair discrimination against females is doing harm to the legitimate concerns regarding potential false positives when evaluating whether content is child-focused or not using machine learning algorithms. But it may be useful for creators making claims of discrimination to consider the potential impact for themselves. We also don't intend to comment on whether or not we regard the use of charged phrases, such as targeting female creators, as unnecessarily inflammatory rhetoric or not. Again, this may be useful for creators to consider for themselves, or to search out resources that explore how placing people in a defensive position can be counterproductive to achieving a desired outcome. We are planning a video on the topic of whether the YouTube current algorithms are likely to be able to distinguish between child-focused content and family-friendly content with relative accuracy, which we regard as the more interesting issue facing creators, including Jackie, as we believe that it has greater practical application in the current environment.